Okay. Thank you, Caitlin. I call the meeting to order and welcome to those online who are watching today. All my colleagues around the table, staff, and to Alan from the news. Okay, so today is the Buller District Council Extraordinary Meeting, 15th of July.
It's the workshop first.
Yep. The workshop first. Okay, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So we'll go to the procurement review, dated July 2026. We've got Jess, Anthony at the table. So Anthony, would you like to take questions as we go or at the end?
I'll actually hand this to Jess. She's running it. I think the key thing here is, I think it's best to let Jess go through what we've got, because that gives the context. And then at the end, we can come back to what the questions are, if that's convenient.
That's fine. Thanks, Anthony. Over to you then.
Thank you all. So this is following on from a RAC report that I presented back in June, where now that we've had a little bit more rigor around procurement at council, I've been tracking how we've been doing, and noted that in 2025 calendar year, there was quite a high amount of exemptions, and a lot of them, they were valid, so there was no concern about the exemptions themselves, more around, do our rules currently fit in the current situation that we're in. So the focus of today's workshop is really around the thresholds for competition, not necessarily the approaches. That's more of a management internal decision at the time, but the actual thresholds and the types of exemptions that we have, whether or not there's any reason for additional ones. So the other thing I just wanted to mention was that when I'm talking about procurement, I have tried to keep it to the procurement activity. Procurement is about the competitive process and how we go about getting a contractor. I haven't really gone into around the contract itself and the fact that in theory every single contract would still have your specifications and the conditions and all that sort of stuff. So this is about procurement as an activity, as a standalone activity. So what I've done is I've included in the docs on tap the current BDC procurement policy. So this was done it was about October 2024, and it's coming up for review at the end of this year. That more sets around the principles that we use around procurement. The procedure document that's also online, I haven't shared that with you, it's 40 odd pages, and that breaks it down into the different approaches and what people must do when and where there's options for flexibility and all that kind of thing. So procurement is really the process of acquiring goods and services. So that can range, it's not just construction. I mean, Anthony's sitting with me, but you know, they're the majority user, so he's obviously been involved in this. But it really does include IT services, it includes stationery, it includes fleet, it's just purchasing effectively.
Excuse me, Jess. So I'll just introduce Rachel Dean, who's our independent chair of the RAC committee, who has joined us online. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you, Jess. That's
right. And as I mentioned, the policy that I've sent you is more around that we, you know, that's the principles around having a standardized framework that the business operates under. In particular, some of the guiding principles are around use of competitive processes, transparency, identification of conflict of interests and mitigations, fairness and impartiality, and privacy and confidentiality. The workshop today really is around the use of the competitive process, wherever possible, though that's where I'd like to get some feedback from you on. So this is the table that I took to the June 2026 RAC. So this is the 2025 summary of procurement, and as you can see, out of 40 procurements that we did, 20 of them were exemptions. When I looked into why what reasons we were using against our current exemptions, a lot of them had to go under the advantageous conditions. It wasn't that the exemption wasn't valid in itself, it's just that the rules were quite limiting. And so the advantageous conditions is really at the discretion of the CE. One thing I did note is that while emergency conditions are there, and so that's often in construction, there's not really any exemptions around the CCO, and that's something I just wanted to tease out. And so I've got some independent advice around that and what other councils have done in this exact situation. This is just a summary table of what our current...
Yes, Councillor Ruxley.
No, we're having holding questions till the end. Okay, thanks, Rosalie. Carry on, Jess.
So this is just a summary table of our current thresholds. So pretty much anything up to $100,000 we can direct source. We can just go to one supplier, get a price from them, and then issue a contract. Anything between $100,000 and $500,000, the preference is to get at least 3. That can be quite challenging in a small town, and sometimes there's actually only 2 local parties that we can go to get quotes. And then the big one is that anything over $500,000 is an open competition. So that would go on. We generally use GETS, that's the government system, that's the government platform. And most people that we deal with are signed up to that. So that's the way to get the information out. Other ways we can do it is, of course, advertising and media and stuff as well. So it's generally just it's an openly advertised process. There's no limitations around it. Just something I would note that NZTA go up to $200,000 before they need to do an open process. So that's for construction, and then $100,000 for professional services. The NZ government procurement guidelines are $100,000 for a full open competitive process. What I did do is I just had a look. There's a local government procurement group that's very active, and it's a very good group. And so I had a look at what some of the other councils did. Someone had done a survey towards the end of last year, so I was able to pull that data. I don't have all 50 odd councils, but this did give 35 councils, and I was able to see what other councils use for their thresholds. 15 of them used the NZ government procurement guidelines of $100,000, and a lot of them also then went to $200,000, which is similar to the NZTA. There was 10 out of the 35 that had a greater value of 200. We were one of them with $500,000. It does get very tricky. That's a very simplistic table. Some of them, for example, do differentiate again between professional services and construction. Some specifically mention a CCO, so they might have 200,000 or 100,000, but the CCO might be $1 million or something to that effect. And so this is a very possibly overly simplified, but the full sheet is quite large, so not ideal for a presentation. I just wanted to though show you that there is differing levels around local governance and how they view value for money, I guess. I also did a bit of research into the audit office, and just to see if we could help define value for money in a Buller context. And there's not really a good answer out there, because value for money means so much to so many different people. So really, it's why I wanted to do a workshop instead, to sort of get the feel from yourselves as to what you felt value for money was. A lot of so that's the guidance from the audit office. So it's looking at public organisations and actually understanding it, value for money in their context, making deliberate choices. So that's where our procurement manuals and our procedures come in at a more operational level, where we do planning and we have to actually identify how we're going to figure this out. Having the systems again, and then monitor and evaluating whether or not the value for money's actually being achieved. This was also just an interesting graph from Audit New Zealand that I sat in on a presentation at the end of 2025. And this was the inquiries they were getting. And I just found it really interesting that of all of their inquiries, 45% were procurement related and 30% conflict of interest related. It just really reinforced for me how much procurement is a challenging topic, and it really needs good oversight. So I just wanted to touch on procurement planning, and this isn't the focus of the workshop, but I did feel that you needed to sort of understand what we do internally. So any procurement that does need to go out to the market, whether it's closed, open, does need a procurement plan written, and that is where you do actually explain how you believe you're getting value for money. So that might be, this is a reasonably straightforward construction project in Ms. Blom's case. So we think we'll just get the lowest price. Other times it might be critical infrastructure, and so you might need specific materials, you might need specific warranties, you might need specific workmanship and the evidence that goes behind that. So we do a thing called a procurement plan that identifies what we're looking for, what the market is for that particular procurement, the risks, and then the approach to get value for money for council. Just some considerations I've put in there. I was asked in RAC to give some costs around how much procurement costs council and also contractors. It's very difficult to give a number and then relate the number to cost savings because each procurement is so different. Some procurements we can do reasonably simply, but we still get 3 quotes. You know, we're still going through a competitive process, but it's a reasonably straightforward job. You can just put something simple out and get some responses, and we still do our conflicts of interest. We still do an assessment, might cost $2,000. Others, I mean, waste services contract, you would no big surprise there. It's been in the hundreds of thousands. So it really does depend on the scale of what we're dealing with. So I have just given some ideas of some costs if you were to do reasonably straightforward tenders, just as an example. The $14,000 was an indicative cost for a tender from Buller Holdings, just to give an idea of what they're seeing from their end as well.
Yeah, I mean, Buller Holdings gave a range of costs for a range of tender prices. So 14,000 was sort of the mid-range of contract, which is the more likely one that we're doing. But otherwise, we can provide a lot more information, and Buller Holdings provided us a very detailed breakdown of how those costs are achieved and what it means for them.
But like I mentioned, that doesn't always equate necessarily to the, you know, it's very difficult to sort of price that into what we're seeing in the result, where we can sometimes get one supplier tender or bid for a job, so you don't know what the range is. Other times we've seen double the amounts. We've had 2 or 3 people in the range from the bottom to the top as double the price, and it can be in the hundreds of thousands. So it can be very difficult to sort of monetize that. So what I've put together is a summary again on our current procurement approaches and the thresholds, and then a proposed approach for discussion. What I've suggested is that for direct sourcing, it might be best to lower that, and I've put down a $50,000 trigger. Then, I should also explain, this is for the total contract value. So if the contract is for, say, 2 or 3 years, then it would be over the lifespan of that contract value as well. Suggested that a closed competitive price, so this would be preferably for 3, but maybe 2 in Buller would be enough. Between about $50,000 to $200,000, you definitely need to go out and get a couple of quotes for that. And anything for over $200,000 would be when we do the wider open competitive process. What I've also done is I got some advice, and we looked at where we might be able to feature the CCO in this. And what we've suggested is a bit more of a specific exemption around the CCO and allowing direct sourcing up to $200,000. And that would still need CE's approval, and it would still need to go through a value for money. Well, all of them go through a value for money assessment anyway, not just the CCO. So the current exemptions that we've got are around emergencies, of course. Following an open tender, there are situations we've had where we've actually gone to market, we've done an open tender and we've had no responses. And so we still need to get the work done. So we've had to find somebody that can actually do that and direct source them instead. There's only one supplier. There is sometimes work that there is actually nobody else. There's no market. There is only one person that can do it. It's a very specific piece of equipment. Additional goods, services, or works. This can be a little bit tricky. I've actually suggested adjusting that. So that's where you've gone to market and you've already had some quotes by person 1, but you want to increase it and maybe increase their scope of services. And exceptionally advantageous conditions, which, as I said, I think this is a good exemption. But I was really thinking that would be used for very odd situations where they were completely unique. So maybe a liquidation or a bankruptcy or something like that, or there was such an innovative process that it really, yeah.
So the exceptionally advantageous condition was the recent tender given to Westreef for the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant. And the advantageous conditions were effectively they're the operator of the plant. They would have to be heavily involved in any construction that was going on. they're also skilled and capable, and from all the tendering options out there, all the contracting options out there, they're the best, the most familiar with that. And of course, dealing with a wastewater treatment plant, the risk of getting somebody else in to try and coordinate all of that was very high. And that was a $2 million order, $2 million tender that was direct awarded by council under that particular condition. And it was a completely appropriate way to do that, because it de-risked possibly the most risky thing we'll do.
So with that in mind, some proposed new exemption rules that I'd be interested in some direction on is around, again, the direct award to CCO, as per the previous slide. Unsolicited proposals or innovative approaches. So it doesn't happen very often, but there is the occasional one time, and I would say that there's one out at the moment where a funding provider is looking at modular wastewater treatment plants, which is a very new and innovative method in New Zealand, and they would be running through their own procurement process as well. So, we could piggyback on some work that they've done and see what that might lead to. Section 17A review. So this is under Local Government Act. If a contract's been in place, generally maintenance contracts under around that sort of six years, we should be doing a Section 17A review. Reviewing contracts in general is probably after 6 years is generally a good idea. With the Section 17A review, you actually run through quite a strict process though around that decision making again. So what exactly are you looking for? What's working at the moment? You run a bunch of different scenarios and see where that comes out. And that came through with the Parks and Reserves towards the end of last year, where that was the process we used to also direct negotiate with West Reef on the new contract there. And the other one is intimate knowledge. So this is very similar to that wastewater treatment plant issue that Mr. Blom just described. So, and you see this in regulatory as well, where you have people that are, it's a very limited market and it's such a specialised function that they actually really understand what's going on, and going to market might not be beneficial in that particular case. And this was just the exemption amendment that I was looking to do. At the moment, so this is for the additional goods and services. At the moment, you have to meet all of these conditions, but again, they are reasonably limiting. And so I was thinking you could do some of the conditions, maybe 2 of the conditions, rather than all 3. Yes, that was pretty much what I was wanting to put forward. And I can go back to these slides and we can discuss it if you'd like to go into detail.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Rosalie.
Well, it's been partly covered by the current exemptions that under emergency, I understand that you've got to get somebody on the spot, but in the likes of when we had the emergency and work is extended over time, I would have thought it was more important than to go through the procurement than just to say, hey, go there, because that was a beef I had that going back to the floods, I suppose 5 years ago, that there were a number of awarded contracts and I wonder about those.
I suppose that's the difference between the immediate response and the recovery from that response. So, and what's quite pertinent, Jess and I were in a civil defence controllers workshop for the last few days, and one of the examples was who funds or decides to fund $100,000 worth of gravel to protect the stock bank. Well, it doesn't really matter because it needs to be done, because the consequences of that of not doing that are enormous. So you get the advice that it needs to be done. It is an emergency. You do that work. We probably have a slight issue with our delegations policy that for emergency works, I think the CE and the general managers each have 50,000, or it might be a little bit more for the CE, which may not cover all of that. And that's something else we will get into later on around the delegations. But in terms of emergency works, yes. Similar situation where a stop bank, and Edgecombe was the example, the stop banks failed. Well, you're not going to fix that during the emergency. Once the river's gone down, someone comes in and fixes it. So you go through a procurement process for that. You go to tender if it's big enough, or whichever way that works. There may be a reason to go to a direct award because of the urgency of doing it and having the available contractor in the available time, because that's always a risk, especially after a flood. But you actually make a conscious procurement decision around that. And that may not have occurred 5 years ago to the extent that it should have. So your point is very valid. There is an emergency, and that's a specific period of time and a specific event. Recovery is something that is and should be planned.
In actual fact, with emergency, you have the emergency and B, recovery.
Thanks, Ray, and then Shane.
A question and then a comment. Jess, you mentioned that there were one or more councils where the threshold when contracting to a CCO was $1 million.
Yeah, from memory, Nelson have 2 million, and I have this feeling that Auckland Council have a CCO limit as well, but I can't remember exactly what it is.
Okay, that answers my question. I was just wondering what sort of councils they were. That's interesting. But the other thing too is just around, the 50,000 threshold. That sometimes discretion is required because I think most of us around this table will be aware of a situation where procurement process wasn't followed for a relatively minor sum, less than $50,000. I'm talking about an advertising contract which was given to an out-of-town supplier. The local supplier wasn't given the opportunity to tender. Yes, it was a small amount, but there were very significant consequences in terms of council reputation. So I'm just putting the case there for discretion, use of local knowledge in some of those potentially sensitive situations.
I want to comment on levels of approval. This where procurement's so tied into delegated financial authorities as well. And so, as I mentioned, when I talk about procurement, I look at the whole of the contract life. And so when I say 50,000, it's within that contract life as well. And so the person needs to also have those delegated financial as well. So that generally would require someone to document.
I suppose the other aspect of procurement, which is hard to quantify, is also the risk. A highly risky procurement, or procurement from a highly risky contract. If it is getting towards the upper end of the limit, you would go, we actually want to go through the physical risk. We would select the appropriate procurement spot, like there being a high level attributes around price only. But the risk profile of the contract can also mean that my team would go for a contract that they would automatically assign. They might come to me and I might look at it and go, no, I want to go to SLP through the Simon before that. And for an extremely risky one, then that would come to this table. So you'd actually understand and accept or decline the risk. So there's a number of steps in procurement which are over and above dollar value, and that risk attribute's a key part of it.
Exactly, Shane.
I've got 3 questions, if that's okay. So the first is around the value for money with CCOs. So when it's a CCO, and of course there's a benefit to the community of using a CCO, is that considered when you're considering value for money?
Yeah, absolutely. The challenge, as I mentioned, though, is it can be very difficult to quantify that.
Yeah,
and so you can't really put it into, you can't go to the market and say, you must be able to pay a dividend, for example. Like that's not something that you could do. And so we consider it as part of our early planning, is there a benefit in going to a wider market and testing it, or is this actually something that would just make more sense to go locally?
Okay. Then the other one I've got is, when we're considering contractors, and this has happened in the past where we have had a major project and there have been ongoing issues with the project. So you would say the quality of work has not been up to standard. is there anywhere where we have a register, like how do we record where we are not happy with a contractor's work, and is that considered when they reapply for contracts?
So this is one of the things I put in the previous council was a professional services panel for that exact reason. So the intent of it is to be 3 years with the right of renewal for another 3 years, so that you could actually allow time to understand how performance is going and have regular review points, yearly review points where you can have some conversations. And we have had, Mr. Blom and I have had to have a couple of conversations.
So do we review the quality of every job, you know, what that's over a certain amount of money, is do we have?
That's the operational procedure that we work under.
Okay. Okay. My last one
But
is.
it's just to
Sorry.
add to that, so the outcome of a review of the contract will go into, so when we do a competitive tender, for example, one of the attributes is track record. So if we have a poor track record with a contractor, then that will have an impact on scores.
Oh, thank you. And my last one is when we're talking about emergency works, I would say, so if I'm looking at, say, the fund at Carter's Beach, that was set up under emergency works after sea inundation. Who owns it afterwards? Like there was no understanding of actually, was it regional council, was it Buller District Council, who is responsible for maintenance? So is this something now that you guys have put in place? Because, you know, when you have something like that that's done under emergency works, then it's left in the no man's land. It becomes a risk in itself.
That's a fair call. So if you're not doing something under emergency works, you do the procurement plan, and then people like myself read it and ask some questions, which can be very frustrating.
Just to clarify, so emergency works, particularly in that zone, would still require retrospective consent. So they've got 3 months. So there's a provision in the RMA which gives 3 months to do emergency works. You have to, within that time, provide a resource consent application to get processed. The applicant of the resource consent is quite generally the owner of the fund, whatever you've built. In this case, I don't know who that was or whether there was a consent completed.
I don't know if there was. It's just a case, and I guess what you're saying is hopefully that wouldn't happen now because there would be a clear process around it.
Clearer and more checks along the process. So like I said, if you're planned, you do that in advance. You're talking in a situation where you're not going to sit down and write a nice 20-page document. That's not the situation that we're in. But that would be where someone like myself would probably look at what happened, where the money was spent, and what do we need to still look at to rectify consents and that kind of thing. And asset management ownership.
Thank you.
Do we invite contractors to quote for emergency work on a unit rate basis so that if we get an emergency, we know we can ring the contractor that's at the top of the list that provided the better prices, that has rates for getting equipment on site, for removing material from the slip, kilometrage rate for removing it to landfill somewhere? Do we have that process?
I mean, it depends on the works. I mean, to be blunt, most of those sort of physical dig things up and move them works, we would, in an emergency, be relying on our CCO district to do that. And we have good historic rates of how they do that. There's always variability around emergencies in terms of if they have to then source equipment from an alternate supplier and things like that. But typically those things are done with a very open book. It's, we need to fix this breach, can you go and do it? And at the end of it, you would sit down and go, well, it took 5 guys 3 days with this many trucks and this many diggers, and we had to open this quarry and do that. So you'd work through that, but there are basic unit rates across those. If it was a specialised issue, so an emergency, say, if there was an IT ransom attack and we had to go to some, I don't know, magic company who can go and fix things, you have very, very limited control on those sort of costs. So it's horses for courses, but for most of what Buller would experience in an emergency, we would know what we would be spending to a degree.
The answer tells me that you didn't quite get the question. What used to be done is that all contractors would be invited to supply a unit rate for emergency. they would hold for the next 12 months. They might tag it for extra fuel costs or whatever. And it meant then that they were the supplier of emergency work for the next 12 months, that they were the one that was provided the best prices, which meant that it was done by a tender process that all contractors had an opportunity to quote on. And when an emergency occurred, whether it's a road blockage somewhere, you rang the contractor that had been pre-selected and you knew what the prices were you're going to be charged. It seemed to be a...
So I mean, I suppose that in that level, that's a slightly different level of emergency that necessarily what we may have been talking about. So for that sort of works, we do have contracts with West Reef to do those sorts of maintenance type works in an emergency. So yes, we do have that.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
But for larger stuff or unexpected stuff, then that becomes more difficult. But we do have generally backup rates that we can refer to.
I'd expect the bigger stuff, you'd have time to call a contract for it individually. But if we look at the dropouts on the
Possibly.
contract, you know, stuff that couldn't be fixed
Thanks,
immediately anyway. Thank you.
Dave?
Yeah, just to touch on what was said before about keeping track of performance, I guess. We used to have I suppose we still do, the 10% of checks or whatever it is, or a set number of checks on work that's carried out by our contractor. Is that what is the current level of percentage of checking, and what is the method for retaining the information gathered from that?
We don't have a fixed percent. It's all contracts must be audited, but I haven't put in a particular percentage for it. Mostly because again, it will depend on the size of the contract. What we have is a record. So the record keeping for contracts. So as we have a contracts register, and so they are locked down to the people that need to know. And all of the audits and everything sit in that. So that includes any evaluation forms that you do post construction or post contract completion. What we need to move into is a way to condense that, which is the next stage from that, is so we can actually see things at an organisation level.
So the short answer is we don't really have a formal process.
We do at an individual contract level. It's just not, it's got to move to the next level up, which is at an organisation view, which is where things like professional services panel come into it. We just don't have a construction panel yet for that.
I suppose the other part in terms of things to check, you have, say you're building a retaining wall, there is an engineer who will be checking each step along there, because the engineer, separate to the construction company, is signing off that the wall's built to design, for example. So all of those checks are in there, and the producer statement the engineer has requires that sort of level. It's the same with trench compaction or laying asphalt or things like that.
Just a bit of a tricky one for you. With the CCO, where they may be required to go and rework something because they haven't met the standard. That's a bit of a tricky one when we actually own them and then they have to go out and rectify it. How do you handle that with the panel? And from a financial point of view?
So that wouldn't be part of the panel. That would be within whatever contract that they're working under. And there's often defect clauses in there. So it really would depend on, whether we've used the maintenance contract, for example, or whether or not we've used what's called a 3910 contract, where there's quite specific defect clauses in there. And that's where, again, those audits and that come into it, because you can actually go back and you've got your record keeping of photos and dates to show progression.
Because our situation with CCO, take an example, West Reef, so they went and resealed the road and the seal lifted, so they had to go back and do it again. Then effectively we're paying at least once, if not twice, for that job, because we're paying for the job and then we're losing, when it comes to the profitability of the company as well. How do we get on in that sort of situation?
I think that might be a better question for Gola Holdings.
I think the answer to that is it's two separate processes. So from a contract point of view, whether it's a CCO or Joe Bloggs Limited, if the contractor fails to perform and rework needs to be done, it's done at their cost. And there's opportunities, there's options if we incur additional costs like engineering and rechecks to recover those costs from those contracts. The next part of that then is if the CCO has done something which causes them to have a loss, which that situation would cause, then that will flow on through the dividend. And that's a risk that council owns by having a CCO. And I would probably argue that at the moment we're getting the benefit of that because they're delivering a better dividend than we would otherwise get if we were just paying out, which means, and we can attest to that over the time, in particular, Jess and I have been here, that the quality of work is actually at a good standard. So we're not overly worried about that.
Okay.
That risk happens with all contracts.
Yeah, I understand that too, and that was a good answer. It's just, something for everybody to be aware of is that if a CCO wasn't maintaining a certain standard of work and they were having to rework it, it's actually costing us, twice for the work because they're not meeting the standards. So I just thought.
We also have other additional avenues with the CCO than just a contract meeting to address that sort of behaviour.
Yeah. Shane, thanks, Anthony.
Just looking at the proposed new amounts, if you looked at that, you would probably think that this is going to create more work and lowering the cost for staff. And so then there is a cost for staff. I guess, what are the benefits? One, are we saying that it tightens up the process of procurement? Is that the benefit that we're hoping to get from this? Because I can see that it would take a whole lot more of staff time to lower these rates.
So I think the benefit for me would be around, really around that, that better control around the risk that procurement brings, which is why I did want to show that Audit New Zealand slide and the amount of times that they have to come in and look at procurement and how risky as an activity it actually is to an organisation. I would just touch on though the amount of time. So if I could use the $200,000, if you were to do a construction job for $200,000 today, you'd still need to get 3 quotes and you would still use a tender process to get those quotes. Okay. So the difference is we would just go to the open market instead. So often, 50,000 at the moment, it's 100. Often if a job costs 70,000 today, we would still probably go and get 3 quotes and we would use a request for quote, which is just a smaller document. So it shouldn't change the current practices. I think it just brings us a little bit closer to a lot of other organisations of local government, New Zealand Government Procurement, NZTA, and lowers that risk around procurement for the organisation.
Just on the less than 50,000, like if we looked at reserve boards, so you're saying you use due diligence, so do you get a quote? If you're going to one person, do you have to ask them for a quote first? No, because I was just wondering for reserve boards, do they have to ensure when a job is over a certain amount or over their whatever it is, the amount they're allowed to spend, is it necessary to have a quote?
So from memory, Chrissy can jump in, but I believe they operate under our procurement processes as well.
Yeah, they do.
Just for those online, so we've changed recently, so we still follow the same procurement processes to ensure that, especially if it's over 100,000, we get multiple quotes. The point to one of the recent changes that we've made, which was following feedback from subcommittees, was that requesting hardworking volunteer subcommittee members to shop around and get multiple quotes for works they needed was time, it was more effort, and it doesn't flow into those expertise. So they know what they want as their end user, but not what we can. So that's something that in the last couple of months we've put into place, that all capital works moving forward will be managed in-house. It's not about us putting any further overheads or anything on. It's actually to help the subcommittees with that process, not only from a procurement lens, but also with the health and safety that comes along with capital works being done with community and volunteers being around.
I'm going to leave it here. Just on that then, do you take into account local knowledge? Because, you're saying you take it in-house, but sometimes reserve boards do have knowledge of who gives best price and who would do work, particularly for reserve boards, at a reduced cost. So do you consider, or do you consult with those reserve boards before you go into that procurement process?
I think the following meeting is going to flow into this a little bit slightly as well. So Jess has got some further answers that she can help with, but absolutely we take their feedback on board. And there is that toss up whether or not we can get almost mates rates from people that know people and love the community that they're in. And also making sure that we're following the correct process and being consistent across anything that council is procuring.
Right, thanks. Any other questions? Dave? No? Rachel, do you have any questions or any views you could share with us?
Well, I had a nice little list here and someone else has already asked virtually every single one of them. Personally, I think that the proposed changes are a good idea for a whole bunch of reasons, like all the other organisations have seen and the reasons that have been given here. And you've already got the right to audit and contracts. So I don't think I had anything new. Like I said, they hadn't already been covered. Other than I think the proposed change is a good idea.
Great, thanks very much, Rachel. Where are you today? It looks like you're at the palace somewhere.
Oh, that's my summer place. That's actually the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg.
That's the beach house. That's the beach house.
Yeah, way back when I was young and wandering. And it was USSR then too, so it was a very interesting trip and I had a whale of a time.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Rachel. Well, if there are no further questions, thanks very much, Jess. Anthony, good job. Well
We're
done.
finished, could you just outline the next steps from here then, Jess?
Well, the delegations policy doesn't really define who sets thresholds. So my proposal was just to bring a paper probably to August, just to confirm this effectively. Reasonably straightforward paper.
Rosalie.
You said that this is up for renewal. Are we going to go through the same process that you did last time, $30,000 worth to settle this up, or is it just sort of virtually rolling over and just checking?
I didn't, there was no money spent on, not a huge amount of money spent on this, I think.
When we
It may have
set
been
up
about
this
5,000.
whole procurement
That was
3 years ago,
remember.
remember?
I did spend some money setting up the professional services panel, and that's not part of this process. So the only real money spent on this is just peer review effectively of my work, just to make sure that it meets industry standard.
So going back to the professional services one, that does feed into here as well. It doesn't at all. Okay.
It has to operate under these rules.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Okay, that brings us to the end of the workshop. We have an extraordinary meeting starting at 2, so we'll break and reconvene at 2, please.
All right, well, thank you. And I'm now off to procure a
Thanks a lot,
plumber to come,
Rachel.
the electrician I've already procured for today. Thank you.
Okay.